As time moved slowly through the medieval world, punishment existed quietly. It was not sudden, and it was not dramatic. It was simply present. In medieval society, punishment followed routine, just like work, just like rest, just like daily life itself. There was no urgency in responding to wrongdoing. Everything happened slowly and with patience. Rules were simple and well known. Most people understood them long before they ever needed to think about consequences. Punishment was not designed to shock or to entertain or to inspire fear. It was designed to maintain order, quietly and consistently. Minor offenses were common, and so were their responses. Small fines, brief restrictions, simple acknowledgments. Nothing elaborate, nothing excessive. These actions were repeated often, day after day, year after year. People expected them. They were familiar. Officials performed their duties calmly, following traditions that had existed for generations. There was no need to hurry. Time allowed every process to unfold naturally. Punishments took place in familiar settings, at familiar times, under familiar conditions. There were no announcements, no raised voices, and no sudden movements. Everything happened at the same steady pace. People observed without curiosity and without emotion. They already knew what would happen. The process was predictable. Waiting filled most of the time. Waiting was normal. Even punishment required patience. Records were kept briefly, often by memory rather than writing. Details were not emphasized. Consistency mattered more than precision. Punishment relied on repetition. Repetition reinforced order. Order was valued above emotion. Daily life continued alongside punishment. Work resumed, meals were prepared, and conversations returned to familiar topics. Nothing changed. Punishment did not interrupt life, it blended into it. Morning passed into afternoon. Afternoon faded into evening. Punishments occurred quietly and ended without notice. There was no sense of conclusion, only continuation. Silence followed each action and preceded the next. The system remained steady, unremarkable, predictable, and slow. Punishment did not dominate thought or conversation. It existed in the background, like everything else. People accepted it as they accepted routine, as they accepted time passing. There was no climax, no escalation, and no resolution, only repetition. Time continued to move forward, slowly and without interruption. You do not need to imagine scenes. You do not need to remember details. Nothing dramatic is happening. You can listen without focus, without attention. The story continues quietly. As time continued to pass quietly, punishment in the medieval world remained steady, unchanged, and deeply familiar. There was nothing new about it, and nothing unexpected. It followed the same patterns, again and again. People learned these patterns early, often without being directly involved. They watched, they listened, and they remembered. Punishment did not need explanation because it was already understood. Rules existed quietly, and consequences followed calmly. There was no urgency in enforcing them. Everything happened at the same slow pace. Minor offenses were handled routinely, without discussion and without emotion. Officials spoke softly and acted carefully. They followed procedures that had been repeated many times before. There was comfort in repetition. Repetition reduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was avoided whenever possible. Punishment did not interrupt the day, it fit into it. Work paused briefly, then resumed. Meals were prepared as usual, and conversations returned to familiar topics. Nothing lingered, nothing escalated. Records were simple, sometimes written, often remembered. Details were not important. What mattered was consistency, the same response to the same action every time. Waiting was always part of the process. Waiting filled the moments between actions. There was no need to hurry. Time was available. Punishment was never rushed because there was nowhere to rush to. People observed quietly, without curiosity and without judgment. They already knew the outcome. The process was predictable. Silence surrounded each step. Silence followed each decision. There were no announcements, no dramatic gestures, and no raised voices. Everything remained controlled, measured, and calm. Punishment existed alongside daily life, not separate from it. Morning routines continued. Afternoon work followed. Evening arrived gently. Nothing changed. The system remained stable. It did not grow harsher, and it did not soften. It simply remained. Day followed day, week followed week, and year followed year. The same procedures were repeated without interruption. Punishment became background noise, present but rarely noticed. People accepted it, as they accepted routine, as they accepted time passing. There was no climax, no conclusion, and no final moment, only continuation. Time moved forward slowly and without interruption. You do not need to focus. You do not need to imagine details. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues quietly. As time continued to move forward at the same steady pace, punishment in the medieval world became something people rarely thought about. It was simply there, always present, always the same. No one waited for it, and no one questioned it. It existed quietly, alongside daily routines. Rules did not change often, and neither did their consequences. People learned what was expected of them, and they adjusted without resistance. Punishment was not personal, and it was not emotional. It followed structure and repetition. Officials carried out their roles calmly, guided by habit rather than judgment. They did not improvise, they repeated. Each action followed the previous one without deviation. There was no need to hurry. Time was available. Waiting was built into every step. Waiting felt normal. Punishment was never dramatic, because drama required change, and change was rare. Most responses were small and predictable. A fine, a warning, a short restriction, nothing that disrupted the day. Afterward, life continued. Work resumed, meals were eaten, and conversations returned to familiar patterns. Punishment did not linger. It left no impression. Records, when they existed, were brief. Names, dates, simple notes. Details were unnecessary. Accuracy mattered less than repetition. The same process, applied repeatedly, created stability. Stability was valued. Villages remained quiet. Punishments took place without ceremony, often unnoticed. People passed by without stopping, without looking. They already knew what was happening. Silence surrounded the process. Silence followed it as well. There were no endings, only pauses. Time passed evenly. Morning turned into afternoon. Afternoon softened into evening. Punishment fit neatly into this flow. It did not interrupt. It did not disturb. It simply occupied a moment and then passed. The system continued unchanged, year after year, generation after generation. The same rules, the same responses, the same calm pace. Punishment became part of the background, like weather, like time itself. People accepted it, without thought, without comment. There was no climax, no resolution, and no final moment, only continuation. Time continued slowly, quietly, and without interruption. You do not need to focus. You do not need to imagine anything. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues quietly. As time continued its quiet and steady movement, punishment in the medieval world became increasingly predictable. So predictable that it rarely drew attention. People no longer noticed when it occurred because it had become part of the ordinary rhythm of life. Rules were not debated, they were remembered. Consequences were not questioned, they were expected. Punishment followed routine, and routine followed time. Officials performed their duties without emotion and without urgency. They spoke briefly, acted carefully, and moved on. There was no reason to linger. Everything followed a familiar order, the same steps, in the same sequence, every time. Waiting filled the space between actions. Waiting felt natural and unremarkable. Punishment was never rushed because nothing else was rushed. Time was allowed to pass. Minor offenses were handled quietly, often without drawing attention. A short pause, a simple response, and then continuation. Life resumed immediately. Work returned to its steady pace. Meals continued as planned, and conversations returned to familiar subjects. Nothing remained. Nothing was discussed afterward. Records were sparse and often unnecessary. Memory carried most details. Precision was less important than consistency. The same response for the same action again and again. This repetition created stability. Stability was valued more than change. Change introduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was avoided. Punishment, therefore, remained unchanged. It did not evolve, it did not intensify, and it did not soften. It simply stayed the same. Villages remained calm. Punishment occurred without announcement and without audience. People passed by, occupied with their own routines. They did not stop, and they did not observe. Silence surrounded each moment. Silence followed as well. There were no endings, only brief pauses. Time moved evenly. Morning became afternoon, Afternoon eased into evening. Punishment fit into this pattern without disruption. It did not stand out. It did not demand attention. It was ordinary. The system continued, day after day, week after week. Generations experienced the same procedures in the same way. Punishment became background, present but rarely noticed. People accepted it, as they accepted routine, as they accepted time passing. There was no climax, no conclusion, and no final moment, only continuation. Time continued slowly, quietly, and without interruption. You do not need to focus. You do not need to imagine details. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues quietly. As time continued to move forward without interruption, punishment in the medieval world became so familiar that it blended completely into daily life. It no longer felt like a separate event, but like another small task in the day. People walked past it, thought past it, and lived past it. Rules were followed automatically, and consequences followed just as automatically. There was no sense of warning and no sense of surprise. Everything happened as expected. Officials continued their work calmly, guided by habit rather than thought. They did not reflect on their actions, they repeated them. Each step was known, each pause expected, each outcome familiar. There was no need for explanation. Everyone already understood the process. Punishment occurred quietly, often without anyone noticing. A brief moment, a short pause, and then continuation. Life moved on immediately. Work resumed at the same pace, meals were prepared as usual, and conversations returned to routine matters. Nothing changed. Nothing was discussed afterward. Records, when kept, were brief, often incomplete, and rarely revisited. Accuracy was less important than repetition. Consistency mattered. The same actions, for the same reasons, again and again. This repetition created a sense of permanence. Permanence felt safe, and stability was valued. Change felt unnecessary and even uncomfortable. Punishment, therefore, remained unchanged. It did not grow harsher, and it did not grow lighter. It remained exactly as it had always been. Villages stayed calm. Punishments took place without audience and without reaction. People were busy with their own routines, their own tasks, their own concerns. They did not stop. They did not watch. Silence surrounded the moment, and silence followed it. There was no ending, only continuation. Time passed evenly. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon softened into evening. Punishment fit into this flow without disturbance. It was ordinary, predictable, and quiet. The system continued, day after day, week after week. Generations grew up under the same rules, experiencing the same responses. Punishment became invisible, present but unnoticed. People accepted it as they accepted routine, as they accepted time itself. There was no climax, no resolution, and no final moment, only continuation. Time continued slowly, quietly, and without interruption. You do not need to focus. You do not need to imagine anything. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues quietly.
As time continued to pass quietly and without notice, punishment in the medieval world no longer felt connected to specific moments. It existed beyond days, beyond weeks, and beyond individual lives. The same rules remained in place, unchanged and unquestioned. People were born into them, lived alongside them, and passed them on. Punishment did not feel imposed, it felt inherited. There was no clear beginning and no clear end, only continuation. Officials carried out their duties in the same way their predecessors had. They learned the procedures by watching, by repeating, by remembering. There was no need to explain and no need to innovate. Everything was already decided. Punishment followed a familiar rhythm, slow, measured, and calm. Each action flowed into the next, without pause and without emphasis. Waiting filled the spaces between steps. Waiting felt natural and expected. Time moved evenly. There was no urgency to conclude and no pressure to act quickly. After each punishment, life continued without reflection. Work resumed, meals were eaten, and routines continued as before. Nothing lingered, nothing changed. Records accumulated slowly, often repeating the same information. Names changed, but procedures did not. Accuracy mattered less than consistency. The same response for the same action, generation after generation. This repetition created a sense of permanence. Permanence felt normal, and normal felt comfortable. Punishment no longer carried weight, it carried familiarity. Villages remained quiet. Punishment took place without notice and without memory. People passed by, focused on their own routines. They did not stop, and they did not look. Silence surrounded each moment, and silence followed it. There were no conclusions, only pauses. Time continued its steady movement. Morning blended into afternoon. Afternoon softened into evening. Punishment fit into this flow without disruption. It was not remembered, and it was not discussed. It simply existed. The system continued, unchanged and uninterrupted. Generations lived under the same rules, experiencing the same responses. Punishment became part of the background, present but almost invisible. People accepted it, as they accepted routine, as they accepted time passing. There was no climax, no resolution, and no final moment, only continuation. Time continued slowly, quietly, and without interruption. You do not need to focus. You do not need to imagine details. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues quietly. As time continued to move forward without leaving a trace, punishment in the medieval world no longer felt connected to people. It felt connected only to time. Rules existed, but they were no longer actively remembered. They were simply assumed. Punishment followed quietly, without intention and without awareness. No one paused to think about it, because thinking was unnecessary. Everything had already been decided long ago. Officials continued their routines, guided by memory rather than thought. They repeated the same movements, the same pauses,
the same order. There was no need to speak and no need to explain. Silence carried most of the process. Punishment flowed through the day like light, like shadow. It did not stand out and it did not interrupt. Waiting filled the spaces between actions. Waiting was no longer noticed because it had become constant. Time felt endless and unmeasured. There were no beginnings and no endings, only continuation. After punishment, nothing changed. Work continued, meals were eaten, and routines resumed exactly as before. No one reflected, no one reacted. Records repeated themselves, lists looked identical, entries differed only slightly. Names changed, dates passed, but procedures remained. Punishment became completely impersonal. It no longer belonged to individuals, only to routine. Villages remained quiet. Punishment occurred without sound and without attention. People passed by, occupied with their own movements. They did not stop, and they did not remember. Silence surrounded every moment. Silence followed each pause. There were no conclusions, only flow. Time continued its steady movement. Morning blended into afternoon. Afternoon softened into evening. Punishment fit perfectly into this rhythm. It did not disturb, and it did not demand. It simply existed. The system remained unchanged, unquestioned, and unobserved. Generations lived under the same structure, rarely noticing it. Punishment lost its presence and became background. Background became normal. Normal became invisible. Time continued slowly, quietly, and without interruption. You do not need to focus. You do not need to imagine details. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues quietly. As time continued to pass quietly and without resistance, punishment in the medieval world no longer felt like a system. It felt like a condition, something that simply existed. Rules were no longer remembered individually. They were absorbed into daily life. People did not think about consequences because consequences were already understood. Punishment followed the flow of time, softly, without shape and without sound. Officials continued their routines without awareness and without reflection. They moved through the same motions, at the same pace, in the same order. There was no intention behind their actions, only habit. Silence carried everything. Punishment occurred and passed without leaving a trace. Waiting no longer felt like waiting. It felt like stillness. Time stretched and softened. There were no clear moments, no noticeable changes, only continuity. After punishment, nothing shifted. Life remained exactly the same. Work continued, meals were eaten, and routines repeated. No one reacted, no one remembered. Records became indistinguishable, lists repeated endlessly, entries blended together. Names lost importance, dates faded, only structure remained. Punishment no longer belonged to people, it belonged to time. Villages remained quiet, unchanged and still. Punishment took place without observation, without sound, and without memory. People passed through their days, guided entirely by routine. They did not stop, and they did not question. Silence surrounded everything. There were no endings, only continuation. Time moved steadily. Morning merged into afternoon. Afternoon softened into evening. Punishment fit seamlessly into this rhythm. It did not interrupt. It did not demand. It simply existed. The system no longer needed enforcement. It sustained itself. Generations lived within it, rarely noticing its presence. Punishment faded into the background, and the background became everything. Time continued, slowly, quietly, and without interruption. You do not need to focus. You do not need to imagine anything. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. The story continues, quietly. As time continued to move forward quietly, there was no moment when medieval punishment truly ended. It did not stop. It did not disappear. It simply continued, unchanged and unnoticed. By this point, punishment no longer felt separate from life. It was woven into the passing of days, into routine, into stillness. Rules no longer needed to be spoken. They were already known. Consequences no longer needed to be explained. They were already expected. Everything existed in balance, without effort and without attention. Officials continued their motions, slowly, carefully, without thought. They followed patterns older than themselves, patterns that required no reflection. Silence carried each moment. Punishment occurred and then passed, without sound and without memory. Time no longer felt divided. There were no clear beginnings and no clear endings, only a steady continuation. Life moved forward gently. Work resumed. Meals were eaten. Rest followed. Nothing stood out. Nothing required attention. Records faded into repetition. Lists looked the same. Entries blended together. Names changed. Dates passed, but nothing else moved. Punishment no longer belonged to people, or places, or moments. It belonged only to time. Villages remained quiet, unchanged, and still. Punishment existed without notice, without reaction, and without impact. People lived within routine, guided by habit alone. They did not pause, and they did not question. Silence expanded. Time softened. Everything slowed. There was no final moment, no conclusion, and no resolution. The story did not end. It simply rested. You do not need to remember anything. You do not need to stay awake. Nothing important is happening. You can relax. Time continues, slowly, quietly, and without interruption. The story rests here.